It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Mr. Charles, a middle-aged teacher at a local high school, noticed the small puppy for the first time. The little dog was scruffy and looked like it hadn't had a proper meal in days. It followed Mr. Charles down the street as he walked to school, its tiny paws barely keeping up with his long strides. He thought nothing of it at first. After all, he was used to the stray dogs in his neighborhood. But as the days went by, the puppy didn't leave his side. Every morning, it would appear at the same spot, waiting for him to walk by, and then it would trot along beside him, its eyes filled with unspoken trust. Mr. Charles tried to ignore it, thinking it would eventually lose interest or find another person to follow. But the puppy was persistent. It trailed him to school, waiting patiently outside his classroom door, and followed him back home after school. The teacher couldn't help but feel a little disturbed by the dog's unwavering loyalty. Still, he shrugged it off, focusing on his work and letting the puppy follow as it pleased. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Mr. Charles walked home through the usual route, when he noticed something different. The puppy wasn't just following him anymore. It seemed agitated, pacing back and forth in front of his house. Something was wrong. Just then, he heard a weak cry from the nearby alley. The sound unmistakable in the quiet night. The puppy darted toward the noise without hesitation, its tail raised in alarm. Mr. Charles hesitated for a moment, but then decided to follow. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the puppy's sudden urgency had awakened a deep sense of concern in him. As he rounded the corner of the alley, he saw her, a frail elderly woman, sitting on the ground, clutching her chest in pain. Her face was pale, and her breathing was labored. The puppy was now at her side, nudging her gently, as if trying to offer comfort. Mr. Charles rushed over to the elderly woman, his heart racing. The puppy, sensing the urgency, stood by her side, its eyes darting between the teacher and the woman, as if urging him to act faster. The woman's face was contorted in pain, her breathing shallow and erratic. Her frail hands clutched her chest, as though trying to hold her heart together. "Are you okay?" Mr. Charles asked, kneeling beside her. His voice was gentle, but the panic was unmistakable. She managed to glance up at him, her eyes clouded with fear. I don't know. I can't breathe," she whispered, the words barely audible. The teacher's mind raced. He had no medical training, but he knew enough to understand that this was serious. He quickly checked for her pulse, weak, irregular. His phone. He reached into his pocket and dialed emergency services with shaking hands. "Please, help. There's a woman here, and she can't breathe. It's an emergency." His voice was strained, anxiety creeping into his every word. As he spoke, the puppy stayed at the woman's feet, nuzzling her gently, trying to provide some comfort. Mr. Charles could feel the warmth of its small body close to his legs. As though the dog understood the gravity of the situation, he glanced down at the puppy and saw the same determination that had led it here. That had brought it to him. It was not just a stray dog, it was a guardian. A silent hero. Minutes felt like hours as he continued to talk with the dispatcher, trying to calm the woman and reassure her that help was on the way. The woman's breathing seemed to get worse with every passing second. Just when Mr. Charles thought he might lose her, a faint siren echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Relief surged through him, but it was quickly replaced by fear. Would the ambulance arrive in time? Would the woman be okay? The puppy barked softly, as if echoing his worry, but then looked up at him with those large, trusting eyes that seemed to convey a message: "Don't give up." Finally, the ambulance pulled into the alley, its lights flashing in the night, casting an eerie glow on the walls. The paramedics rushed over, immediately taking control of the situation. Mr. Charles stepped back, his hands trembling as he watched them work. The woman was loaded into the ambulance, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to breathe. The puppy, still by his side, wagged its tail. The moment felt surreal. Was this little creature the reason he had come this way tonight? Was it fate that brought him here, guiding him to this woman in need? He looked down at the dog, who had never left the woman's side. "You're something special, aren't you?" he murmured. The dog, as if in understanding, gave a soft bark and nuzzled his leg. It was as if the dog was telling him, "It's not over yet." As the ambulance drove away, Mr. Charles watched it disappear into the night, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. He looked at the puppy, wondering what would come next. It had saved a life tonight. But in a way, it had also changed his own. This was no longer just a stray dog following him, it was a lifeline. A reminder that sometimes, even in the most ordinary of lives, the smallest actions can have the greatest impact. With the night still young, the teacher felt an odd sense of connection to the puppy. "Let's go, little one," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "We have a lot to do." The next few days were filled with an uneasy calm for Mr. Charles. The woman, Mrs. Jane, was rushed to the hospital, and he kept checking for updates, hoping that she would pull through. Meanwhile, the puppy, whom he had named Toby, stayed by his side, never straying too far. Toby was no longer just a stray dog. He had become a constant companion, a silent guardian, guiding Mr. Charles through his days. The teacher, too, had grown attached to the dog, and despite his initial reservations, he couldn't ignore the strange connection they now shared. It was an unusually cold Thursday evening when Mr. Charles received a call from the hospital. Mrs. Jane had made it through the night but was still in critical condition. The doctor said she would need constant care if she were to survive. Mr. Charles's heart sank as he listened to the doctor's words. He knew that she had no family to rely on, and the thought of her being alone in such a vulnerable state troubled him deeply. That night, as Mr. Charles sat on his couch with Toby curled up at his feet, he made a decision. He couldn't let Mrs. Jane suffer alone. He had to do something, no matter how difficult it might be. Toby looked up at him as if understanding his thoughts. His eyes filled with that same quiet loyalty. The dog had followed him here, and now, it was time to return the favor. The following morning, after a few quick phone calls, Mr. Charles arranged to bring Mrs. Jane into his home. He would take care of her, at least until she recovered enough to be independent again. He wasn't sure how it would work. He still had a full schedule of classes to teach and responsibilities at school, but he knew he couldn't leave her in the hospital alone. As he prepared to leave for the hospital, Toby stood by the door, his tail wagging gently. It was as if the dog knew that something was about to change. Mr. Charles leaned down and scratched Toby's head affectionately. "Let's go, boy," he said softly. "We've got work to do." Arriving at the hospital, he was greeted with somber news. Mrs. Jane was in even worse condition than they had anticipated. Her heart wasn't responding to the treatment, and the doctors were unsure of what the next steps should be. Mr. Charles's heart tightened with the weight of the situation. He spent the next few hours by her side, holding her hand and speaking to her in quiet reassurance. He promised her that she wouldn't be alone. That evening, after Mrs. Jane had been transferred to his care, Mr. Charles brought her back to his apartment. With Toby trailing behind, Mrs. Jane, frail and weak, was settled gently on the couch, with Toby lying at her feet, his presence a calming balm. The sight of the elderly woman and the dog together seemed almost surreal. They were both fighting for survival in their own way, and in some strange way, they had found each other. Over the next few days, the bond between Mrs. Jane, Mr. Charles, and Toby grew stronger. Toby stayed close to Mrs. Jane, never leaving her side, just as he had never left Mr. Charles's side before. The dog seemed to sense when Mrs. Jane needed comfort, curling up beside her, gently nuzzling her hand, and offering her quiet companionship. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a soft shade of pink, Mrs. Jane turned to Mr. Charles with a weak smile. "You've given me more than I could ever ask for," she whispered. Her voice was frail, but the sincerity in her words filled Mr. Charles with warmth. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes as he looked at the elderly woman. "You've been so strong, Mrs. Jane. You're not alone anymore," he replied softly. And at that moment, as Toby curled up by their feet, the strange journey that had begun with a small, determined puppy came full circle. They had all found each other when they needed it most. When they arrived at Mr. Charles's apartment with Mrs. Jane, the sense of urgency had not faded. Mrs. Jane was frail, her face still pale from the ordeal, but there was a flicker of relief in her eyes as she settled onto the couch. Toby, as if sensing the weight of the moment, laid beside her, offering quiet companionship. The room was still, save for the soft sound of Toby's breathing and the occasional rustle of the old woman adjusting herself on the couch. Mr. Charles sat at a distance, watching them both with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. He had no idea how long he could balance his responsibilities at the school and taking care of Mrs. Jane. But one thing was certain, he could not turn his back on her now. The dog, too, had become an essential part of this makeshift family, its presence comforting in ways Mr. Charles never expected. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Mrs. Jane grew stronger. Toby, as always, remained close by her side. He would curl up beside her in the mornings, and when the evenings came, he would rest his head on her feet as if guarding her from any danger. Mr. Charles continued to juggle his teaching, finding moments during the day to check on her, make sure she had everything she needed, and offer words of encouragement. Despite his exhaustion, he could not help but feel that this was the right thing to do. One afternoon, as Mr. Charles was preparing to leave for work, Mrs. Jane stopped him. Her voice, though still weak, carried an urgency he hadn't heard before. "Charles," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out for his. I know I don't have much time left, but I need you to promise me something." Startled, Mr. Charles paused, his bag still slung over his shoulder. He knelt beside her, listening intently. "Promise me," she said, her voice cracking, "that you'll take care of Toby. He's saved me, and I want him to have a good home. I can't ask for more than that." The teacher swallowed hard, his heart heavy with emotion. Toby had, in many ways, saved them both, guiding him to Mrs. Jane when she needed help. And now, in turn, making their small family whole. "I promise, Mrs. Jane," Mr. Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise I'll take care of him, no matter what." It wasn't a decision he made lightly. He had grown fond of Toby, and he knew that the dog had brought something into his life that he had been missing, something he had never expected from a stray dog. That evening, as Mr. Charles walked home from school, he thought about the promise he had made. The weight of it settled on his shoulders. But there was also a sense of peace. Toby had a home, and now, so did Mrs. Jane. The pieces of their lives had fallen into place in ways none of them could have anticipated. But it wasn't over yet. When he entered the apartment, he found Mrs. Jane resting, a faint smile on her lips. Toby was curled up beside her, his small body rising and falling with each breath. It was as if the two of them were now bound together by something greater than fate. It was the bond of survival, of loyalty, and of love. Later that night, after Mrs. Jane had fallen asleep, Mr. Charles found himself sitting by the window, gazing out into the quiet city. He thought about the unexpected journey that had brought them all together. What started as a simple act of kindness, helping a stray dog, had blossomed into a profound connection between a teacher, a dog, and an elderly woman who had been lost and alone. As he sat there, Toby quietly padded over to him, resting his head on Mr. Charles's lap. The teacher stroked the dog's fur gently, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've changed my life, Toby," he whispered, "and I think, in a way, you've changed Mrs. Jane's too." Toby gave a soft bark, as though acknowledging the truth in those words. It was in that moment that Mr. Charles realized that the real journey had only just begun. Life was unpredictable, and none of them knew what the future held. But they had each other now, and that was all they needed. They had found their place in the world, and they would continue to walk together, no matter where the road took them. It was a quiet evening when Mrs. Jane passed away. She was resting peacefully, Toby curled by her side, and Mr. Charles stood nearby, his heart heavy with the finality of it all. It wasn't a moment filled with drama or grand words, it was simply a quiet passing, a conclusion to a chapter of their lives. But for Mr. Charles, the real journey was just beginning. With her passing, the apartment felt emptier than before. Toby, ever watchful, stayed by his side, offering comfort without question. There was no need for words between them. The dog had been his silent companion through this difficult time. And now, it was more than just an animal, it was his only family. Days passed, and with each one, the bond between Toby and Mr. Charles deepened. The teacher found himself going through the motions of life again, teaching, grading papers, marking assignments, but every evening when he returned home, he was greeted by the wag of Toby's tail, the warmth of the dog's body against his legs. It was simple, but it was enough. The park was where they often went in the afternoons, walking side by side, with Toby running ahead, chasing after a ball. For the first time in a long time, Mr. Charles felt a sense of peace. There was no rush, no pressing deadline, just the joy of being in the moment. It was during these walks that Mr. Charles realized how much he had needed Toby, not just as a pet, but as a friend, a confidant, and a reminder that loyalty, even from a dog, could heal wounds deeper than he had ever imagined. One day, as they walked, Mr. Charles stopped and looked down at Toby, who had come to a halt ahead of him, looking up with those familiar, unwavering eyes. "You've changed my life. You know that?" Mr. Charles said softly. Toby wagged his tail, sitting down beside him as if to acknowledge the truth of those words. From that moment on, Mr. Charles knew what he had to do. He would never leave Toby. Not now. Not after everything the dog had done for him. Toby had found him when he needed him most. And now Mr. Charles would make sure the dog would always have a home. They weren't just a teacher and a dog anymore. They were family.